our hopes may be for the future, for reducing this threat or living with it, there is no escaping either the gravity or the totality of its challenge to our survival and to our security. A challenge that confronts us in unaccustomed ways in every sphere of human activity. This deadly challenge imposes upon our society two requirements of direct concern, both to the press and to the President. Two requirements that may seem almost contradictory in tone, but which must be reconciled and fulfilled if we are to meet this national peril. I refer first to the need for far greater public information, and second, to the need for far greater official secrecy. The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society, and we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers which are cited to justify it. Even today, there is little value in opposing the threat of a closed society by imitating its arbitrary restrictions. Even today, there is little value in ensuring the survival of our nation if our traditions do not survive with it. And there is very grave danger that an announced need for increased security will be seized upon by those anxious to expand its meaning to the very limits of official censorship and concealment. That I do not intend to permit to the extent that it's in my control. And no official of my administration, whether his rank is high or low, civilian or military, should interpret my words here tonight as an excuse to censor the news, to stifle dissent, to cover up our mistakes, or to withhold from the press and the public the facts they deserve to know.
It is relevant because that is the functional ambition of these malicious Confederate terrorists in their KKK secret subversions, including the use of legislation, of infiltrating the federal and state governments in order to get arbitrary applications of confusion of jurisdictions to justify the exceeding of the limitations of law concerning the enforcement from those particular groups through double talk out of both sides of the mouth, as they are functionally in practice KKK and not members of their lawful office.
Is the US a functioning democracy? Well, let's have a look at it. It costs $2 billion to become president. They're 25% of the total prisoners in the world. They spend over $800 billion a year on arms, which is more than most of the world put together. They've been at war for 250 years since their state was formed 275 years ago. But they can't afford universal health care. They can't afford the $1.7 trillion debt forgiveness for students. They can't afford a program for the 17 million children that go to bed hungry. Is this a functioning democracy? What's your idea of a democracy?
You would know this this is a bit of an aside, but in terms of how you think about problem sets, when I was a cadet, what's the cadet motto at West Point? You will not lie, cheat, or steal, or tolerate those who do. I was the CIA director. We lied, we cheated, we stole. It was like we had entire training courses.
It would have been more appropriate for Mr. Trudeau, Prime Minister of Canada, to address this House according to Article 144, an article which was specifically designed to debate violations of human rights, democracy, and the rule of law, which is clearly the case with Mr. Trudeau. Then again, a Prime Minister who openly admires the Chinese basic dictatorship, who tramples on fundamental rights by persecuting and criminalizing his own citizens as terrorists, just just because they dared to stand up to his perverted concept of democracy, should not be allowed to speak in this House at all. Mr. Trudeau, you are a disgrace for any democracy. Please spare us your presence. Thank you.
We become involved when disinformation poses a threat to the security of our country. It is when there's a connectivity to a threat to our country. It could be a threat, a connectivity to violence. And what this working group does, is precisely what I would think you would want it to do, which is to take a look at the work, the disinformation work that our department has done, and ask the following questions. Do we have policies? Do we have guardrails? Do we have standards?
But here's the problem. We can't even agree. We can't even agree what disinformation is. You can't even agree that it's disinformation, that the Russians fed information to the Steele dossier. If you can't agree to that, how are we ever going to come to an agreement on what is disinformation so you can police it on social media?
Senator, I have 2 points, if I may finish. Number one, that what this working group does, because it's not an office, what this working group does is ensure that there are guardrails, definitions, standards to make sure that the free speech rights, the civil liberties, and privacy rights of individuals
So
are not impinged.
do you think COVID disinformation threatens our national security?
And number two, if I may, Senator, and number two, is it your proposition that when the cartels spread disinformation with respect to our immigration policies to try to lure vulnerable migrants to our border illegally?
I think you've got no idea what disinformation is, and I don't think the government's capable of it. Do you know who the greatest propagator of disinformation in the history of the world is? The U.S. government. Are you familiar with McNamara, the Pentagon Papers? Are you familiar with George W. Bush and the weapons of mass destruction? Are you familiar with Iran-Contra? I mean, think of all the debates and disputes we've had over the last 50 years in our country. We work them out by debating them. We don't work them out by the government being the arbiter. I don't want you to guardrails. I want you to have nothing to do with speech. You think we can't determine, speech by traffickers is disinformation? You think the American people are so stupid they need you to tell them what the truth is? You can't even admit what the truth is with the Steele dossier. I don't trust government to figure out what the truth is. Government is largely disseminating disinformation.
Rationality belongs to the cool observers, but because of the stupidity of the average man, he follows not reason but faith, and the naive faith of the proletarian requires necessary illusion and emotionally potent oversimplifications, which have to be provided by myth-makers to keep the ordinary person on the right course.
And it might sound radical, colleagues, but the answer to war is not more war, it's peace. And peace isn't delivered by the barrel of a gun, it's delivered by diplomacy, by dialogue. You can wish away your continent's history, but we share a continent with Russia. We will sit down with Russia. There will be a negotiated peace, and this organisation should be promoting it earlier rather than delaying it and making sure that more Ukrainians die. Your feigning of sympathy rings hollow. It makes me sick, to be honest with you.
We had a good discussion on ensuring global energy security and adequate oil supplies to support global economic growth. And that will begin shortly. I'm doing all I can to increase the supply for the United States of America, which I expect to happen. The Saudis share that urgency, and based on our discussions today, I expect we'll see further steps in the coming weeks.
Are you worried about
Well, one four principal functions of the CIA is to gather intelligence and ideally forward it to the president, the users of information, the policymakers, as they say. There are other functions, however, some of them more legitimate than others. One is to run secret wars, the covert action that's written and talked about so much, like what's happening in Nicaragua today from Honduras. Another thing is to disseminate propaganda to influence people's minds, and this is a major function of the CIA. And unfortunately, of course, it overlaps into the gathering of information. You have contact with a journalist, you will give him true stories, you'll get information from him, you'll also give him false stories. For example, in my war, the Angola War that I helped to manage, 1/3 of my staff was propaganda. Ironically, it's called covert action inside the CIA. Outside, that means the violent part. I had propagandists all over the world, principally in London, Kinshasa, and Zambia. We would take stories which we would write and put them in the Zambia Times, and then pull them out and send them to a journalist on our payroll in Europe. But his cover story, you see, would be that he'd gotten them from his stringer in Lusaka, who had gotten them from the Zambia Times. We had the complicity of the government of Zambia, Kenneth Kaunda, if you will, to put these false stories into his newspapers. But after that point, the journalists, Reuters and AFP, the management was not witting of it. Now, our contact man in Europe was, and we pumped just dozens of stories about Cuban atrocities, Cuban rapists. In one case, we had the Cuban rapists caught and tried by the Ovimbundu maidens who had been their victims, and then we ran photographs that made almost every newspaper in the country of the Cubans being executed by the Ovimbundu women who supposedly had been their victims.
These were fake photos?
Oh, absolutely. We didn't know of one single atrocity committed by the Cubans. It was pure, raw, false propaganda to create an illusion of communists, eating babies for breakfast and that sort of totally false propaganda.
I can no longer remain in today's Democratic Party that's under the complete control of an elitist cabal of warmongers who are driven by cowardly wokeness, who divide us by racializing every issue and stoking anti-white racism, who actively work to undermine our God-given freedoms that are enshrined in our Constitution, who are hostile to people of faith and spirituality, who demonize the police but protect criminals at the expense of law-abiding Americans, who believe in open borders, who weaponize the national security state to go after their political opponents, and above all, who are dragging us ever closer to nuclear war. Now, I believe in a government that's of the people, by the people, and for the people. Unfortunately, today's Democratic Party does not. Instead, it stands for a government that is of, by, and for the powerful elite. Now, I'm calling on my fellow common sense, independent-minded Democrats to join me in leaving the Democratic Party. If you can no longer stomach the direction that the so-called woke Democratic Party ideologues are taking our country, then I invite you to join me.
The undisciplined, unprofessional military of the Confederates actively have a malicious position of infiltrating the United States government and its various offices, and have the direct order by their compelled alliance and collaboration as a Confederate insurgency to exceed their lawful superiors, which is functional superseding of their jurisdiction, to overpower those who outrank them, in the position which includes the acts of sedition, in the arbitrary plausible deniability and other various frauds which are specifically designed by which to trap the United States public and redirect the position away from those who have American civilian authority into the ones who have the power generated for the buy-in of the Confederacy, which manufactures their mechanisms of war by the use of theft of American equipment, through their insurgency as terrorists without a legal government, and that includes the sedition of targeting David Bowles, which should be summarized.
But what are we, a team? No. We're a chemical mixture that makes chaos. We're a time bomb.
You need to step away. Why shouldn't the guy let off a little steam?
You know damn well why. Back off.
Oh, I'm starting to want you to make me.
Yeah. Big man in a suit of armor. Take that off. What are you?
Genius, billionaire, playboy, philanthropist.
I know guys with none of that worth 10 of you. And I've seen the footage. The only thing you really fight for is yourself. You're not the guy to make the sacrifice play. To lay down on a wire and let the other guy crawl over you.
I think I would just cut the wire.
Always a way out. You know, you may not be a threat, but you better stop pretending to be a hero.
A hero? Like you? You're a laboratory experiment, Rogers. Everything special about you came out of a bottle.
Understand that that is the material culmination of everything that they functionally are engaged in doing, at which point the position of Steve Rogers or Captain America in that position towards Tony Stark is the taking away of the things that makes him the particularly useful member of their unit or team, at which point their targeting of these types of systems is the superseding of their jurisdiction, and their application of sedition against David Bowles assumes that he would have acquired the position of intelligence oversight as a new branch of the military, ranking to the position of general, acquiring a position on the Joint Chiefs of Staff, at which point it's not just taking away David's character as Tony Stark's character's suit of armor, but the playboy billionaire philanthropist aspect, which is the also compounding defamations and injuries in order to prevent non-violent remedies, which is their functional position in order to funnel or current the use of remedies into the predetermined high-grade, high-violent, high-damage conflicts, which is the use of the position of saying that anyone who isn't with the Confederacy is a violent, terrorist, lunatic threat to the public, which is only particularly interesting or possible by the use of their systematic removing of remedies, such as their remedies to their criminal federal programs, including their use of selling equipment from the United States military to the United States Federal Bureau of Investigation, which also includes their acceleration of this into inserting themselves into the House through their surveillance mechanisms, which includes equipment that they sell, such as stingrays and exponentially more terrifying nerve-hacking terrorist torture mechanisms, which are acts of military equipment for the use of acts of war, for the destruction of property and the mechanism of the destruction of persons, papers, and effects, which includes the use of tormenting people as to not allow them to be alone in their home alone because of the surveillance entry into the home, allowing them to engage in the use of shooting them through the walls for the use of torture mechanisms, such as their sleep deprivations and harassment torture mechanisms, which includes the use of extreme forms of injury, which includes the use of terrorist threats and application of threats of violence, which includes the use of permanent injuries, which is their functional position, which is downgraded to the position of selling it to local law enforcement or cops, as well as sheriff's departments. Now, the federal sheriffs and their active engagement in the manipulation and terraforming of the system and their cooperation with the various unions protecting the corruption which they accelerate in suppressing of those who are competent to perform their services is the validation of the overthrowing of the United States, at which point who's supposed to enforce the laws against the insurgents becomes the primary terrorist threat, at which point they destroy the United States and its offices through infection, at which point the use of these terrorist mechanisms through their various subversions are a Nazi mechanism of protecting the use of criminal arbitrary violence with the false assumption of a mechanism of oversight which has no functional authority, at which point the intelligence oversight crafted by the Confederacy mimics the Nazi one, which was paid for as blueprints, which generates their position of having no ability to, in practice, restrain functions of intelligence, which is the point of the intelligence oversight, at which point the point being subverted as they cannot restrain, as the oversight does not have authority over the application of the enforcement and its customs, allows it to become the position of the Satanist devotion. And the position of the Satanist devotion generates many children's questions, which is arbitrarily brought up. So, a common Sunday school question: why can't Satan repent? And the position is the same reason the FBI and CIA can't repent. All they can do is change how they do the enforcement. So they need artificial policies to be generated in order to redistribute how the enforcement is presented to the public, which does not in fact change any functional mechanisms, as they are KKK terrorists who are overthrowing the government and have systematically been overthrowing the government, at which point their attacks against the various denominations of the KKK which they turned against are in fact inadequate on purpose in order to prevent the possibility of substantive remedies, as they are Confederate militia insurgents terraforming the United States back into the position of the original Confederacy, at which point you have in function the application of lynch mobs and the application of KKK terrorism, which is the functional destruction through their various applications of government equipment without authority of law, which is not a problem for them, for they have no functional service to law, which would have restrained them otherwise. State, federal, sheriff, or otherwise, who are compliant with these positions are engaged in the use of terrorist overthrow of the United States directly by insurgency or by subcontractor position, which is common to the intelligence apparatus such as the NSA, which generates the position of their hyper payments and their payments of higher wages to the employees of the company subcontracting, generates a larger bill which injures the United States by the overpaying for an injury, at which point it's not just overpaying for a service, which it is, but it is the payment of a service specifically subversive by the use of criminal secrets in order to be destructive to the functionality of the designs or blueprints of these United States. And that is the justification to their use of criminal violence against David Bull's character, as he is essential to the American security and prosperity against these terrorist operations, which are systematically engaged in terrorism and ex post facto policies in order to terraform the United States after the fact, which cannot substantively be supported by any lawful American government, as they are in fact materially Confederate felons who do not have the authority to maintain government office or receive government payments such as Social Security or Medicaid, as they are fully to be disbarred from any positive use of government. And their targeting of David Bowles is the systematic suppression through human trafficking, so that they could put him in different places and change his schedules, and the application of enforcing the fruit of the poison tree or their schedule for their entertainments, for their objective positions, including their false moralizer positions of defamation, which generates a false series of records as a false problem, which is materially observable as dangerous from their mechanisms of alternatively applying their use of violence against the other targets, which generates the actual injury which would have not existed in the original position or in the position of their human trafficking of the target outside of their use of force, such as their use of the terror factory, which is the functional position of them creating terrorist or criminal plots, which they ultimately end up enforcing, and they, talking out of both sides of their mouth, engage in the use of their doublespeak in order to jimmy rig the procedures and the laws to subvert justice by definition, at which point they seek the timing out of the ability to proceed through protocol as opposed to the service of law, which would have validated their obligation to seek the position of justice, which would be a direct lie on their part, as they are in fact subverters of justice, and these being known terrorist fraud attacks are criminal abuses of authority through color of law and color of office for the position of their insurrections, at which point David receiving the criminal suppressions would have exponentially been reduced in his living conditions and his ability to have taken care of himself, as the zombie insurance structure mechanism, even at the foundation, is exponentially superior to the living conditions that they are restraining him to, as they are engaged in the use of harassment and tortures in the reduced living conditions in every material way, including their mechanisms for the position of giving the false status through their criminal suppression of status as a justification to their various defamations, which allows them in practice to get paid for the false proceedings generated by their abuses, which they do not want a remedy to, as they are functionally terrorists, and the remedy to that would be American justice, and everyone who signs the barring of those remedies is a felon seeking the overthrow and destruction of the civilian republics of these United States. If they materially observed their obligations, they would have had to have paid David market price for the various engagements beyond his original contracts, at which point you would have their obligation to pay his original human decency and his original market prices, which would have exponentially compelled them to become a professional military, which is subversive to their core identity, as they, by definition, do not materially have any standards, as standards and morality are abhorrent to them, while they virtue signal morality, which they would actively condemn. Ryan Paul, I believe, as Speaker of the House, while that was happening, I believe there was a condemnation, a mild rebuke by a federal pastor who oversees the position of guiding them through their religious duties, at which point the condemnation of him compelled him to be removed. And while I don't recall his specific name, I do remember the incident having occurred, at which point this is the acknowledgement that they view the concept of being rebuked as morally abhorrent in their inverted morality. So morality is condemned by everyone who supports these Confederate terrorist felonies, which would, by any justification or stretch of the imagination, have to be rebuffed by anyone loyal to Christianity standards, at which point anyone who sees what they're doing or comprehends aspects of it would mutually rebuke them on the position, as opposed to affirm the false authorities of the insurgency. Many of these creeps are actively subversive to any stable society, at which point many of them are actively avoided in public whenever observably connected, as they require, the general community requires the ability to stay safe from these aggressively pedophilia-based cultists, which is, I'm pretty sure, the best way to describe them, as they have the position that the executive has the authority to compel a minor in order to have sex with an executive agent, at which point their orders to these positions includes their various collections of people off of the random street, at which point they become aggressively subversive to any kind of presumption of stable society, at which point their identities being allowed to influence or overpower or coerce other members of the community exponentially generates arbitrary infinite threats which are inherent to their functional nature, at which point you have to actively seek their arrest and prosecution and full conviction to throw the book at them, but they are using the arguments of protecting the thing that they're guilty of, at which point you have the double talk in question, which is the material application of their use of fraud in order to perpetuate their infinite variations of their criminal black market, which is a mechanism in many cases of them generating war profits, which includes their war profits generated into financing their war against the American civilian base or the United States Republic. At which point you have many people who are engaged in the fraudulent application of asset forfeitures, and these positions of asset forfeitures makes the product guilty despite any connection, at which point you have to have a full representation of the thing. Now, the person, the papers, and the effects of the thing is the property of the person, and thus the item itself cannot, by definition, under the constitutional authority, not be guilty, and thus it would be an attachment to the title of the person, at which point you understand the inherent fraudulent nature of asset forfeiture, which is a system of Confederate theft of American properties at an arbitrary infinite variety, making them highway robbers, at which point you have the infinite application of their terror factories, which is 100% manufactured by themselves with proxy agents or targeted individuals who are actively being trafficked, can be applied in the use of being manipulated, such as the Charlie Manson, I believe it was Charlie Manson, who was an active CIA agent who was actively generated in the position of creating a CIA-based cult, which generated murders, at which point you understand that these active systems were systematically applied and used for the system of the Confederacy's destruction of American safety. And it is only possible to protect yourself if you stop pretending that the ones making you endangered have any mechanism to the service of your safety, at which point their refusal to serve law is the position of them being a terrorist insurgent without the service of law or any government authority, at which point you have to actively use the government to arrest and subvert these terrorist felons in order to protect yourself against any of these positions, including their false generation of moral panic systems, which generates their arguments to increase their funding as well as their resources and their excuses to the use of force in order to digest Confederate standards from the federal grade military equipment powers and strategies and procedures down to the local levels, applying them as an enemy combatant of the United States, as the mechanism requires their arrest and dismantlement of the application of these threats is necessary to national security and the public safety. There is no lawful right to the refusal to serve law in the function or application of the duties of a government office, at which point their positions of their supports from their fraudulent union mechanisms makes it almost impossible to fully punish the criminal Confederate double agent, which is the objective purpose, at which point the Confederate double agent would be hyper-accelerated in the office, such as in the sheriff's departments. At which point you have the promotion of the Confederate loyalists, and you have the suppression of the Americans who are serving law, at which point you can't excel in their offices if you do not comply with their arbitrary corruptions, which includes their pedophile trafficking markets, which is actively maintained throughout the United States and around the world for the financing of their criminal wars, including their criminal wars against the American civilian population. And viewing themselves as separate to the Americans, they have pet names such as civilians as a derogatory term, separating themselves, as they would have an alternative understanding for their group, which is ultimately Confederates. Once you file through all of the phantom cell protection mechanisms and false security excuses, at the position that we understand this, there is the obligation of the use of the duel for the complete and total arrest and prosecution and sentencing of the public threats of those in government refusing to serve law so that they can advance the position of their Confederacy. Ask the question, why was Jeffrey Epstein executed? They say that he was committed suicide, but no one actually functionally believes that. Why was his collaborators not properly punished? Why, when he was punished and fully acknowledged as being guilty, was he not properly dealt with? And the answer is the position of this CIA asset, or the intelligence asset mechanism, of him being functionally an aspect of their permanent mechanism, which is the confession to the government's involvement in a pedophile human trafficking mechanism as a position of their compromise as well as profiteering mechanism normal to the Confederate society. They are not properly dealt with for the same reason J. Sekulow declared an act of war against the other states, as California was overthrown to be a retainer in the war against the United States. The position was not that J. Sekulow is against pedophilia. The position is that J. Sekulow supporters are not serving law so that they can validate and reinforce and protect beyond remedy, advancing the false legislations stacking up to protect their pedophile market of their higher abusive members, at which point their more malicious terrorist abusers, their more criminal components would be accelerated, such as the position that if they're hurting the child instead of just having sex with them, that it's somehow okay. If they're hurting the child's sexuality, that somehow it's no longer sexual assault when you are attacking their genitals through a piece of equipment, at which point their position of it being malice or false punishment without a crime qualifies it as the use of a hate crime mechanism of social engineering and of racism and all other prohibited activities, which is normal to the function of Confederacy as an adversary of the Americans, at which point you understand that anyone who supports J. Sekulow's war is in fact a pedophile Confederate terrorist felon. None of them have any morality. None of them have any loyalty to the United States or to their communities. They are exclusively a Satanist group of maniacs who have to be removed from society in order to protect any competence or sanity, at which point their use of these surveillance mechanisms in the advancement of their false excuses generates their abuses against many of the members of society, which they are abusing on the basis of getting their various reactions in the general public, such as their use of terrorism against homosexuals who would not have otherwise been homosexual, or trans who would not have otherwise been trans, or etc. At which point you have the false position of them creating the scenario from their false excuses with the obstruction of justice, which allows them to craft the false narrative which is necessary to accelerate additional policies which have no functional interest in the position, as they are criminally void under the definition in the Black's Law Dictionary of a function that subverts the spirit of a law is void, at which point none of their functional positions have any redeeming quality, any moral quality. None of them have anything but absolute hatred and contempt for their obligations or for the American people. There are no Christians who support them. There are people who go to church who, like Satan, were once with God and who, seeing upon themselves the superiority of themselves, pursue the assumption of their own personal superiority, at which point they are happy to eat the fruit of the poison tree in order to assert the knowledge of good and evil, in order to develop themselves in the maturity of themselves as equal to God, at which point their manufactured position is an old-time sin which is foundational to the service and subjugation to Satan, as the rejection of God and God's ways and God's places and God's territories and God's systems, as they, by virtue of these mechanisms, similar to the Pharisees who actively engaged in the persecution of Jesus Christ as a character, qualifies their position of rejecting their own God to the point of brutal murder to the highest level that they could possibly imagine as a primary objective, so that they and not God can gain the glory, so that they and not God can gain the profits from the mechanism of the systems which belong to God, as they inherently are subversive as a false angel of light, serve exclusively darkness and separation, as their Satanist devotion to their fascist systems has no conceivable connection to anything that could be perceived as moral in any particular mechanism, as it is exclusively Satanist sacrifice abuse systems for the advancement of historic evils generically condemned by the source materials by which they derive their particular authority.